From Interfaith Alliance, this is State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. Those powerful words from James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time represent the courageous way Baldwin thought, wrote, and spoke throughout his career. I often quote him on this show and have always found him to be profoundly spiritual. And so when a book titled The Gospel According to James Baldwin gets published, it's a safe bet we're going to want to talk about it on State of Belief. And so author Greg Garrett will be with us in just a minute.
Vice President Harris spoke to a women's convention of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and she was questioning DeSantis's state standards that taught about slavery in ways that somehow saying that there was some benefit for people who were enslaved.
Religion plays a role in so many of the events that shape our lives, whether we know it or not. Religion News Service journalists Adele Banks and Jack Jenkins are at the forefront of covering those stories, and we'll get a roundup of news you might have missed during the summer, as well as look ahead to what's breaking this fall. We are growing State of Belief, building on our 17-year history by partnering with Religion News Service, the leading religion journalism organization in the country. And as part of the RNS family of podcasts, there's a next generation State of Belief podcast I want to make sure you are subscribed to. Please visit stateofbelief.com/new podcast. It would really help to have you subscribe and to tell people you're close to about the conversation you are hearing. State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how you can help keep this show going is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my first guest. James Baldwin was a prolific American novelist, essayist, and social critic known for his profound insights into the complexities of race, identity, and sexuality in America. His groundbreaking works, including Go Tell It on the Mountain and The Fire Next Time, challenged societal norms and played a pivotal role in advancing the civil rights movement. Now, a book celebrating James Baldwin as a prophet of humanity has just appeared. The title is The Gospel According to James Baldwin, and the author brings a depth of expertise to this project. The author of over 30 books, Greg Garrett is a longtime professor at Baylor University and is canon theologian for the American Cathedral of the Holy Trinity in Paris. Professor Garrett, welcome to State of Belief.
Oh, Paul, thank you so much. It's a joy to be with you today.
So, Professor Garrett, could you give us an overview of the life of James Baldwin for our listeners who may not be as familiar with who he was and the times he lived in? Where did he grow up, and what was the trajectory of his career?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. I wrote this book for people who love Baldwin and people who don't love him yet. And so that's one of the essential things is that people need to understand who he is and how important he is. And one of the things that I talk about from the very outset, during much of the sort of response to Baldwin and the critical response to him, he's been talked about as a great Black writer or a Black gay, writer. And both of those things are reductive. He is very simply one of the greatest American writers in our history. And so 60 years ago this week, his book, The Fire Next Time, was atop the New York Times bestseller list. It was on the bestseller list for 41 weeks. And so how did he get from where he started to that place of prominence where he can be rightfully thought of as one of our greatest writers and thinkers. He was born in Harlem in the 1920s. He was the eldest of a number of siblings. His stepfather was a cruel, hard man who, as Baldwin says to his nephew in The Fire Next Time, made the mistake of believing what white people said about him. And he was broken by life and tried to break other things around him. That whole, broken people break other things. So from his early life, he was surrounded by poverty and squalor and racial oppression. But he also realized early on that he was smart. And he had a teacher, a white teacher, Orilla Bill Miller, who encouraged him to write, took him to Broadway shows and movies. It is because of Bill Miller, he says, that I never really learned to hate white people. And he also received the encouragement of other Black artists and Black writers. And so after some time in the Black church, where he had been a really successful preacher, and as he says in an open letter to Desmond Tutu towards the end of his life, Baldwin's life, some people say I never stopped being a preacher, and I'm pretty sure that they're right.
That's a great quote. I mean, hence the book title, Gospel According to James Baldwin. That's fantastic.
Where, in seminary, my homiletics professor was always asking us, where's the good news in this? And that actually is, that's the controlling idea behind this book. Where's the good news in what Baldwin has to tell us about our humanity, about the possibilities? So he arrived in Paris with, I think, $42 to his name. And he arrived there as many American artists, writers, musicians have over the years, white, Black, male, female. He lived in sort of abject poverty for a while, borrowing money, doing odd jobs, trying to write, trying to finish his first novel, the book Go Tell It on the Mountain. But he also discovered the freedom there that came from being an American citizen. And he writes in Notes of a Native Son that what made a difference in Paris was the color of his passport. The color of his skin had not changed, but the color of his passport set him apart. And so he was aware that there was, Paris has its own varieties of injustice, but the French like to think that they are colorblind. And as Richard Wright, one of Baldwin's mentors, said, in Paris, I'm treated as a human being. So for Baldwin to come and to have the freedom to be a writer, it's not something that there was latitude for him where he was in Harlem or even in New York City, but the distance that he gained allowed him to kind of look and reflect, and also to see, as I said about Paris, that these are universal problems. Racism, injustice, xenophobia, there's plenty of that in France. So it's not unique to America, although we have our unique permutations that certainly shaped him and that he had to escape. So when I began thinking about Baldwin, it was almost certainly I thought about writing this book in a cafe in Paris. And I have been going to Paris for 10 years and spending 6 to 8 weeks a year there, which adds up. That is a lot of months in the tower of the American Cathedral in Paris. And I wanted to follow Baldwin around because not only had he taken such a hold on my heart and on my mind, but I had begun to think of him in the way that as an Episcopalian, we think about our saints. We want to walk in their footsteps, and that there is something sacred, however you understand that term, about the places that they have been and the things that they have touched, the tables at the cafes where they have sat. And so following Baldwin around in Paris for a few years while I was reading him was an essential part of the writing of this book. And then following him to Switzerland, where he had the breakthrough that allowed him to finish Go Tell It on the Mountain. And in a long early interview with Studs Terkel, he talked about how that winter, I think it's 1951, he was in the village of Leukerbad in the Swiss Alps. He was there with his lover, Lucienne, whose family had a chalet, I guess that's a thing, in the Alps. And he would write and drink and listen to Bessie Smith singing the blues. And what he told Studs Terkel is there and that far away from home, where he was literally the only Black person those villagers had ever seen. He writes about in a later essay. That distance and his reconnection with the idiom of the blues and with the language that he grew up in, allowed him to finish that book and also to make some sort of essential understandings about the differences in racism in Europe and in America. So one of the last essays in Notes from a Native Son is called Stranger in the Village. And it is the essay that he wrote after several trips to Lukerbad, being followed around by the children who pointed at him and wanted to touch his hair and rub his skin. And, he said, eventually I'm going to go back down the mountain. They don't have to accommodate me. I can be this, circus exhibit to them. But we do not have that luxury in America. In America, we are family. I mean, literally family. And we can't walk away from each other. We can't, push one group or the other into the sea. We're going to have to learn to live with each other. And as he says to his nephew in The Fire Next Time, genuinely love each other, because that is our only way out of our chains. Right. So in the book, I wanted to include my journey to that village because first, it was terrifying. And there's some nice dramatic interest in that because I'm really afraid of heights. And also because I felt that even though Baldwin was not an outdoorsy kind of person, and when I go to these Swiss mountains, I'm going to walk around some. You stand there and you touch the building where he lived and worked. You listen to the sound of the Catholic church bells tolling through the village. And I'm writing a piece on this right now because, Baldwin was, he left the church, but the church never left him. And I just think of him sitting there and hearing that bell tolling the hours or calling people to worship. And he is outside of it, but he is also permeated by it. So that experience was so central to the writing of this book. And that village is a place I'm going to go to write for the rest of my life. Mr. Baldwin had some really good ideas.
Yeah. James Baldwin was a successful writer, as you said. He was on the top of the New York Times bestseller list. He was on the cover of Time magazine. Yeah. However, he was a controversial figure. You don't speak the kind of truth with the power that he spoke it in such a convincing way without gaining some adversaries. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the struggles that he faced throughout his life as people kind of took him on. I mean, he had a famous debate with Buckley, I think, in Cambridge. Yes. We talk about the saint and how wonderful it was. And, if we know anything about saints, is that generally it's not all like fun and games. There's
going to be some suffering.
Talk a little bit about how he was understood by the American public and what he had to kind of go through as his star rose.
Yeah, that is such an interesting thing to think about. There were times in his life when people of every spectrum were angry at him. So there were white people who felt that he was pushing too hard or telling too much truth. One of the tropes that's introduced in The Fire Next Time that echoes throughout his work is the idea that the American people would prefer to be ignorant, and that way they can be innocent. And so, one of the reasons this book is so important, it matters so much, is that we are in a new phase of that, right? So, people, I live here in Texas, and I've been in a number of states traveling over the last couple of years where the legislatures have said, we don't want to offend any of our students, by which they mean our white students who might be exposed to the history of what their grandparents or great-grandparents may have done. So by saying just that simple truth, that we have to tell the truth about our history, Baldwin was automatically guaranteeing that there would be a group of people who would be upset. Because there are lots of ways that we've tried to mythologize or to romanticize the whole lost cause myth. But Baldwin was controversial in some white circles because of that desire to tell the truth about our history and his desire to witness to the suffering that he saw in Harlem, in Watts, in various places in the South. He made I'm terrified of heights. James Baldwin was terrified of the South, and yet he went. Later on in his life, there were plenty of Black writers, thinkers, activists who didn't feel like he was hard enough, willing to go far enough. And so there were later writers who said, what is all this love stuff? And in a very real sense, although there were some very obvious differences between Dr. King and Baldwin, there was also real affection and appreciation there. And it seems to me that Baldwin held tight to that view of the primacy of love when other people were saying hate might be the way forward.
Well, it's interesting. There was a moment that you described in the book that I had not known about, which was it was an interaction where in one of his essays, he had talked about something about the church and something and people wanted King to condemn it. And instead King said, no, I don't condemn that at all. Actually, like that's really an important witness, I think. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember being impressed both with Baldwin for saying the thing he needed to say and also for King for not shying away from hearing that truth that he probably clearly agreed with in some ways. What was that?
Well, and, just to sort of sketch out that relationship a tiny bit more, I came back to faith in the Black church. And so I know a whole lot more about the Black church than I did growing up Southern Baptist in a very, very white church. And in many Black churches, there's a lot of discomfort around LGBTQ issues. So Dr. King looked at Baldwin, admired him as a writer, was nervous about his sexuality. It's one of the reasons he was sidelined in the 1963 March on Washington, along with Baylor Rustin, who planned the march.
Right.
But during my archival research, I actually found that, and I was delighted. It was a letter from Martin Luther King's lawyer to James Baldwin's agent. So this is all back channels, right? It feels like diplomacy and people meeting in dark alleys. But what the lawyer wanted to transmit and have Baldwin understand is that people were asking Dr. King if the Fire Next Time was unchristian. And King's response was on the contrary. Not only is it one of the greatest statements of where we are on race and where we should be, but I consider it to be absolutely Christian. And that affirmation, I'm sure, would have been a powerful thing. Particularly because, as we said, there was pushback against Baldwin from one quarter or another, throughout his life. Right.
Talk to me a little bit about he had this place. Talk to me a little bit about this. It's one of the most famous, and it's on the internet a lot. This kind of interaction between him and Buckley, which felt like a very much of like it's built the meeting of the Titans, in this corner. Like, how do you understand that meeting, which I guess was at the Debating Society in Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, the Cambridge Union. I think it was 1965. And just for your listeners, I want you to know Nicholas Buccola, Buccola, has written a fantastic. It's sort of a twin intellectual biography of Baldwin and Buckley, and I refer to it in my book, and I interviewed Nick for my book. Baldwin was incredibly articulate, clearly very smart. Buckley, the same. And so there was this idea that, let's put them together in this sort of, I don't know, Elon Musk kind of cage match sort of thing. Let's take these two kind of towering intellects and put them in a room, and let's see what happens here. And if your listeners have watched this, basically what they see is Baldwin mopping up the floor with Mr. Buckley. The standing ovation that Baldwin receives clearly startles him. I I have a very good friend, Anthony Reddy, who is the first professor of Black theology at Oxford.
Hmm.
And for some years, we have talked about what it's like to go into the heart of the empire and try
Hmm.
and do justice work. Because one of the things that Baldwin understood, King has a similar sort of statement, but the problem in changing the status quo is that the people who occupy the high positions in the status quo don't want them to be changed. And here he is walking into one of the two sort of hearts of the British Empire, Cambridge and Oxford, to tell these hard truths. And he was heard, you know?
Hmm.
And Baldwin is facile, he's smart, but the truth, and capital T truth, that radiates out of what Baldwin says and out of his own use of his lived experience clearly resonated with them. I do a lot of this kind of work in churches and for church organizations where I walk in and talk to people who look like us about why people who look like us should care about race.
Hmm.
And for many of those conversations, it's that first place of recognition. So you look at all of those masters of the universe, in the Cambridge Union, who are like, yes, this is true.
Hmm.
I always wonder what happened next. And my fear is that probably nothing did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. I mean, I think that, that's, I think you can actually make a categorical statement that nothing did, at least for a while, and is still needing to happen. I want to close with, just for me, the idea of achieving our country, which is part of his, great line from The Fire Next Time, and the title of a book of my cousin Richard Rorty, Achieving Our Country, and
Mhm.
such a it's this idea that this is possible and that
Yeah.
it has to happen, and so I think what you're describing here is like that movement towards it, and it's tortured, and unfortunately people who are the tension is that those who are being hurt right now are not as are being asked to sustain that hurt as we move
Yes.
forward
Yes.
at this ever slow pace, whether on racial issues or LGBTQ issues. But if we can continue to move forward, I think that's so important. And I love that you part of what the book emphasizes is the hope that Baldwin can offer us, and that perhaps that's really part of the gospel of James Baldwin, is that with all the suffering, but there is love and there is a movement. And so I really appreciate you being with me here on State of Belief, and I encourage everyone to check out this book. If you've read Baldwin and you love Baldwin, this is a great book to read, The Gospel According to James Baldwin. And if you haven't read Baldwin yet, but you want to be introduced to it, The Gospel According to James Baldwin is a great introduction. And I won't say especially, well, maybe I will say, especially if you're coming out of a faith tradition and you're trying to figure out a way to understand a writer who maybe isn't part of the canon of faith writers traditionally, but should be.
Yeah.
Dr. Greg Garrett is a renowned American author, professor, and cultural critic, celebrated for his insightful exploration of faith, culture, and literature. With a career spanning multiple genres, he has penned thought-provoking books such as The Prodigal and Entertaining Judgment, offering unique perspectives on spirituality and contemporary society. Greg is a professor at Baylor University and is canon theologian for the American Cathedral of Holy Trinity in Paris. Professor Garrett, thank you so much for joining me here on State of Belief today.
Oh, Paul, you're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll take another break now and be back with religion journalists Jack Jenkins and Adele Banks. If you miss any part of today's program, you can hear full episodes of State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. And make sure you subscribe to the Next Generation podcast. Please go to stateofbelief.com/new podcast. That's stateofbelief.com/new podcast. You're listening to State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.
I'm Roxy Stone.
And I'm Caitlin Beatty.
Saved by the City is a podcast from two Christian women cracking the code of faith from the mean streets of New York City.
Our podcast captures what happens when purity culture meets hookup culture, when distraction steals from devotion, and when the diversity of viewpoints and lifestyles clash against assumptions.
Gotham can be a weird place for Christian women, but we're out there, and we have stories to tell.
Saved by the City, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. So what did we miss in religion news, and what's likely to make headlines in the months ahead? I'm joined by veteran Religion News Service journalists and award-winning journalists, I might add, Adele Banks and Jack Jenkins. Thank you so much for being back on the show.
Thanks so much for having us.
Listen, you guys wrote some great pieces this summer, and I want to do a little bit of a review because I think a lot of times people are like, okay, I'm going to try to disconnect. But these pieces deserve to be read. And Adele, I want to start with yours. I loved your piece talking about the women on the March on Washington. And you went back and interviewed so many cool women, many of whose stories were never told, and also gave a context about like women's voices kind of not being heard at the March on Washington 60 years ago. Tell me about that story and tell our listeners about like kind of the emotion of that story.
Thank you for asking about that, Paul. I appreciate it. And thanks for having Jack and me again. We appreciate that too. So I will say that it was January that I decided that I wanted to write this story. I knew that the March on Washington's 60th anniversary was coming up, and I wondered how to do it differently. On the 50th anniversary, I will back up and just give that context. There were actually two commemorations, one on the actual day and one that was truly 50 years after, excuse me. And then there was another one like on the weekend. And so I was able to go to, I think it was the weekend one, and do video footage and work with an intern. And we had like 10 different voices, different people in a package of stories at that time. So this time around, I thought, well, let's focus on the women, because as you said, it's an interesting this time around. There's been big attention for the fact that there were not a lot of women voices. In some cases, they barely said a word or they sang a song, which is important, but they didn't get to have the major speeches that the men did that day. And I understand from one of my sources who I quoted in the top of the story you're referring to, Reverend Barbara Williams Skinner, that there was still some, anger and angst about that many years later for the women who had been behind the scenes but didn't get to be in the front on that very special day. So I did some searching for some people. I happened to interview Bishop Vashti McKenzie, who is now the head of the National Council of Churches. I think I interviewed her because she had just gotten that role. And somehow in that interview, she happened to mention that she had been at the March on Washington. And so I said, well, I'm definitely going to circle back to you about that. And she remembered how hot it was. She remembered wearing ankle socks and Mary Jane's shoes.
That was a very funny part of the story. She was like, you showed up like correct, dressed correct. Like everyone was dressed correct, even if it was really hot.
Right. Exactly. But she also was helping her family that is in the Afro-American Black newspaper business collect information that day, and was able to help them figure out who was there and who they should report on, which is kind of cool as a journalist hearing one of my sources talking about that. So that was one example. And then there were a couple of others that I was able to find as well. There's a woman who had been involved in King's Birmingham jail letter, Willie Pearl Mackey King, who also was involved in the planning of the march. And so she was able to talk about that and how shocked she was when she heard King's speech be different than the words that she typed up numerous times as they'd gone over drafts as a group. So that was interesting. And then
I loved that. It was so interesting to hear someone who was really behind the scenes, and it sounded so much like kind of every event that anybody's doing. You're not doing the script. You're not doing the script. Right. We all did so much work.
And Mahalia Jackson is credited for saying, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." So that's another example of a woman who had a role that wasn't as prominent to this day, but that was part of why we ended up hearing those words. And then the last person was someone else I learned about named Sandra Sandy Hassan, and she was a student who was a marshal at the march, and she was there when Malcolm X came by with his entourage, so she got to hear him talking to the press, and before he moved along to the next part of the National Mall for the rest of the event. So I was just pleased that they were able to talk about women who had some connections to faith, who were involved 60 years ago, still remembered it, and could talk to me about it.
It's just, it's a really, it was a great example of finding the story that hadn't been told and letting us know. I mean, I loved it. And it's an important event for us to commemorate, and even more beautiful to know a little bit more of the nuance of that day. And also some of the emotion that I had never actually heard those stories, or even the emotion around women. It's obvious, it makes sense. But it was just really, really helpful. It's a great example of the role of journalism. Tell stories that will change the way we perceive an event and widen it and illuminate. So thank you for that. That was great. Jack, one of your stories that I really was intrigued by was about Pope Francis and him actually addressing some of the Catholic agita in America, and how his words were received, and what impact does a pope have on actual on-the-ground Catholic politics, which are so volatile right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there was this interesting moment that occurred earlier this year while the Pope was visiting Portugal. He was actually hanging out with a group of Portuguese Jesuits, where apparently one of the Jesuits mentioned that he had done kind of a sabbatical in the United States, and that he had people come up to him and kind of complain about the Pope, and he was expressing concern about that. And the Pope, in his response, kind of discussed what he referred to as this kind of stream of Catholicism in the United States, that he kind of characterized as kind of backward, as well as he warned against instances where ideologies replace faith. He used the word reactionary, and it was this interesting moment that kind of elicited a response from kind of the more right-wing elements here of Catholicism here in the United States. And I should note up front that Pope Francis is actually very popular among Catholics in the United States. He has an 83% approval rating as of a year or two ago from Pew. But there is this very particular strain that has been very vocal in either directly criticizing the Pope or in some instances more kind of being on the opposite end of his message. And so we kind of talked about some of those groups. Some of that is say Raymond Arroyo at Eternal Word Television Network, which was this is actually a very large Catholic media enterprise that used to kind of be more specific religious programming, and more recently kind of got into the news space. And Raymond has kind of become this talking head on that program, who also very often moonlights on Fox News. And during one of his Fox News segments, he actually mocked a Vatican official who got COVID despite being boosted, again, kind of leaning into this anti-vaccine sentiment, while Pope Francis had actually been very pro-COVID-19 vaccines, characterizing them as an act of love. And more specifically, Pope Francis also kind of mentioned the idea of potentially clerics, prelates here in the United States who might be on the opposite end of him when it comes to ideology and theology. And the name that kind of has come up a lot here in the United States is Bishop Joseph Strickland, who's caught a lot of flack over the last couple of years for a variety of reasons. Everything from kind of undermining his fellow bishops, kind of promoting priests who have defied their bishops for refusing to get vaccinated, to he actually was one of the prayers at the Jericho March, which was an event that led up to the January 6th insurrection. And I should note, there's been a little development on that. There was some reporting and some rumors that Pope Francis actually met in Rome with some people who and discussed the idea of potentially asking Bishop Strickland to resign, given the myriad of controversies he's had. And we do know that his diocese is the subject of Vatican investigation right now. We know that he was approached by a Vatican official last year. But Strickland told me that if he were asked to resign, that he would not do so voluntarily, setting up kind of this, potential fight with the Holy See. So that's kind of a good little glimpse at, Strickland is a hero to a lot of these more far right and right wing Catholics in the United States. That does seem to have at some point irk or at least gotten the attention of Pope Francis over in Rome.
Well, that little tidbit is very odd, I have to say. Like, what are you going to do? Like, create a breakaway church? I mean, that I don't know I don't know. Anyway, I'm not too versed on Catholic hierarchy and ecclesiology, but that seems like something that one wouldn't say. But what do I know? I'm just a Baptist. So those stories are some of what happened over the summer. Were there any stories you wanted to tell that you saw that you didn't get a chance to tell, but that still feel important in this moment, that come out of the last, say, 3 or 4 months that you see continuing to develop?
Well, I can name at least one. It's a story that I think is interesting because it's kind of it's not a story. So what I mean by that is that, watching the 2024 Republican presidential candidates, right? We have seen some, dialogue and appeals to faith. Mike Pence does it pretty regularly. We've seen some of the other candidates also reference faith in public appearances. But one of the ones that's most interesting to me is that you have Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who was, touted to be like the great rival to Trump leading into this, and that has proven to be untrue, and at least in polling so far throughout his campaign. But another odd thing about it is that he is Catholic, and that he was asked about that early on in the campaign while appearing on a evangelical Christian network. And actually kind of, while he didn't, deny that he is Catholic, he kind of instead, when asked about it, kind of referred to Catholic traditions as I think he might have used the word neat. Someone can fact check me on exactly the word he said. It was something that was not overwhelmingly enthusiastic, and pivoted immediately to language that you would more often find in an evangelical context, talking about the importance of a personal relationship with a faith and with Christ. And it's been interesting to kind of see him throughout his campaign so far. I just saw him speak last week here in D.C. To an evangelical Christian group, in which he was again kind of leaning more heavily into more evangelical Christian rhetoric and theology than you might have found in a more traditional Catholic space. And I think there's a lot to unpack about why he might be doing that. What the game plan is there, whether it'll work. But just the idea of a Catholic candidate really kind of spending more time in evangelical spaces and using evangelical style rhetoric than you might expect. And with only, to my estimation so far, he had one tweet where he showed that he had met with a prominent Catholic bishop. And outside of that, I haven't seen him lean too heavily into that space, which seems interesting and peculiar to me.
Yeah, well, that says a lot about the kind of the way I think perhaps the Republican field feels like they have to navigate religion, is that, if you're not doing evangelical Christianity, you're not doing religion correctly for the primary. And it would be, if he were ever to become the candidate, it would be interesting to see how he would navigate that if he were to make it to a general election.
Yeah.
Adele, what were there any stories that you saw building up this summer that you feel like might still have salience in this fall?
Yes, the one related to the Southern Baptist Convention, and specifically its decisions about women in ministry, because there were a number of things that came to the floor at their meeting in June. My colleague Bob Smetana was there in person covering it, and I covered it from afar. And they made a step to amend their constitution to state that only men can be pastors. That's going to require a second vote in June next year. But they also expelled some churches, including the church that Rick Warren started, Saddleback, because they had women pastors. And the question is, what happens next? Like, first of all, everything that happens at the Southern Baptist Convention often trickles down to the state level. And there was one meeting, which many people probably missed this summer, with the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which is the more progressive of the two state Baptist conventions in Texas that relate to Southern Baptists. And they affirmed women in ministerial and leadership roles, quote unquote, but they did not specifically use the word pastors as far as who they were affirming, which made the organization Baptist Women in Ministry disappointed because they wanted more clarity. So what I'm trying to say is that there are questions looming about what's going to happen to women in ministry who are in churches connected to Southern Baptists. And there's also a dimension of this related to predominantly Black churches, many of which are aligned with more than one Baptist denomination. Some are historic Black Baptist denominations, some are the Southern Baptist Convention, and one is. And so the Black ministers have met with the president of the Southern Baptist Convention to express their concern about how this is going to affect the women in ministry in their churches. So there's lots kind of brewing. Some of it's going to happen over the next few months as the state conventions meet and say something about this topic. And then, of course, next June, we'll see more. So I feel like that's an ongoing story that will merit being having tabs kept on.
Yeah, thank you. That's super interesting. And, I think a adjacent issue that I saw this summer was all the Southern Baptist Seminary presidents making a statement about critical race theory. And I just felt like that was such an odd, that's what we're focused on. But I'm just wondering also, like, down the road, how, there's been a lot of effort of the Southern Baptist Convention to address racism in their past, or at least a lot of voicing of that desire. And I just don't know how that action correlates with a sense of progress among Black Southern Baptist churches and members. So
that's a good question. Some of them have left over this issue, that they thought that this was not where they need to focus, and were disappointed that the leaders are putting such an emphasis on it. And then the others are staying and trying to stay together. I covered a gathering of the Black Southern Baptist group a year or two ago, National African American Fellowship, and they were kind of imploring their number to stick with the denomination despite the fact that this issue has cropped up and not gone away.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting, the religion and how it intersects with life and people, which is just the way it is. How have you all been seeing other dimensions of this upcoming 2024 joyful election season, which I'm sure will be life-giving and full of great ideas that people are, parsing through and deciding which candidate? Is there anything right now that you see as a major telltale sign of what's to come in 2024 as we begin to enter into this with more gusto as we end out the fall and begin the next year?
Well, I'll just note that, I think one of the interesting things that I've been doing in kind of covering Christian nationalism is kind of seeing how there are certain issues that these smaller groups and smaller organizations that aren't attached to presidential campaigns are continuing to spend their time on, and how those end up bubbling up into the rhetoric of presidential candidates. So, for instance, a lot of conversation around schools, a lot of conversation about LGBTQ rights, and also trans kids that are showing up in education contexts, in particular opposition from far-right circles to a lot of what LGBTQ rights advocates would argue are LGBTQ equality efforts, and really attaching that to education, attaching that to children. When I was telling you earlier about the time seeing DeSantis speak here in DC last week, he spent a lot of his speech on that same topic. And so those are often kind of like a window into like what it's going to look like to the end of the primary, right? How that manifests in the general election, we'll have to see. But it's certainly true that, some of these smaller organizations like Turning Point USA, led by Charlie Kirk, and, that have really kind of embedded in themselves in Christian nationalism of late, they've kind of invested in a kind of faith outreach element where they are actively trying to recruit pastors to embrace this kind of political message from the pulpit. Those are all indicators of, the kinds of people that say the Trump campaign or the DeSantis campaign could be talking to between now and whenever the GOP primary ends. And quite frankly, if it's either of those two candidates, I would expect them to continue pushing on those issues right up until Election Day 2024. So I just think that part's fascinating. Like even earlier, you were talking about, the Southern Baptist Convention. Turning Point USA was hosting one of the events at this last one, right? Like their efforts weren't necessarily successful to kind of push the message that they wanted, but that shows the level of interest that these overtly political groups are showing in religious communities as a way to kind of push out a message that clearly seems to resonate with Republican candidates writ large, and potentially, whoever ends up being the nominee.
Yeah.
Another thing that might come up, but I really don't know yet, but I'm intrigued as to this whole question about how Black history is looked at. And again, this is the DeSantis issue. And Vice President Harris spoke to a women's convention of the African Methodist Episcopal Church over the summer. And she was questioning DeSantis's role on having state standards that taught about slavery in ways that seemed to her to be inappropriate, somehow saying that there was some benefit for people who were enslaved. So that seems to not be going away as far as a concern. I don't really have a handle on how wide it is beyond Florida, but there are certainly issues about this that are drawing attention from folks, and some of those folks are voters. And so I don't know how high it'll be on the list of voting issues, but I suspect it'll be higher up on what's on people's minds when they walk into the voting places this time around.
I think that both of those issues, we think of the bread and butter issues, economics and unemployment and things, but these are the issues that some people will come out for. We're going to be doing an event in October for our listeners, live stream October 18th on book bans, and really like what it means for people to say you can't know about these stories about these people because it's going to that's bad for your kids, like under the idea of parental rights and whose parents, whose rights. And so these are major issues that really do have a lot to do with religion and how, what we can believe, what we can know, what knowing our history. I've heard of churches in Florida, Black churches that are beginning to teach Black history because they don't trust that actually the school will be teaching Black history in a truthful way. So these are all amazing stories. Listen, I love having you on. I love being able to say thank you for the storytelling you're doing, and that we see it and we appreciate it. You can go to religionnews.com, and this has been great. Adele M. Banks is projects editor and national reporter at Religion News Service. An award-winning journalist, she was previously religion reporter at the Orlando Sentinel and a reporter at the Providence Journal and newspapers in the upstate New York communities of Syracuse and Binghamton. Jack Jenkins is also an award-winning journalist and national reporter for Religion News Service. He's also the author of the book American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country. Thank you both for being with us again on State of Belief.
Thanks so much for having us.
That's all the time we have for this week's State of Belief. Please be sure to subscribe to the new and improved podcast called The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. Subscribe to The State of Belief today. We need your help keeping State of Belief going. I hope you'll consider being a partner in this crucial work by making a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And you can be part of making sure informative and encouraging voices like these are heard by sharing this program with family and friends. Let's get more people listening and more people taking part both on and off the air. And join the conversation. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at State of Belief, and share State of Belief with the people in your life. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Raushenbush on State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.